He invited her to his wedding, not to celebrate, but to make her feel small. The ballroom at the Langford Hotel glittered under a forest of crystal chandeliers, every table dressed in ivory linen, every glass catching the light like polished ice. Soft music floated over the murmur of wealthy guests, but beneath the elegance was something colder, something sharp. Claire Bennett stood near the back of the room in a simple midnight blue dress, her hands folded so tightly at her waist that her knuckles had gone pale. Across the room, Ethan Walker laughed too loudly beside his new fiancée, his cufflinks flashing as he raised a champagne flute. He had once promised Claire forever in a two-bedroom apartment with peeling paint and a heater that rattled in winter. She had believed him then. She had worked double shifts, skipped dinners, sold her grandmother's silver to cover his business debts, and smiled through every sacrifice as if love could survive on endurance alone. It hadn't. When Ethan's company finally took off, so did his patience. He started correcting her in public, then dismissing her in private, then replacing gratitude with contempt. By the time he handed her the divorce papers, his voice had gone flat, almost bored, as if he were signing away an old receipt. Now he stood beneath a wall of white roses, telling anyone who would listen that Claire had always wanted too much, asked for too little, and knew how to disappear when life stopped being convenient. A few of their old friends smiled politely. Some looked away. One woman even let out a soft laugh, the kind people make when they do not want to be the next target. Claire did not move. She did not interrupt. She simply listened, her expression calm enough to unsettle the people who expected tears. That was the first thing they failed to understand about women like Claire. Silence was not surrender. It was storage. It held everything. The humiliation, the sleepless nights, the year she spent learning how to breathe without asking anyone's permission. And tonight, she had not come alone. In the mirrored wall near the entrance, she caught the reflection of a man stepping out of a black sedan, his posture quiet, his presence unmistakable even from across the room. He was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, no unnecessary display, no need for it. When he crossed the threshold, conversations softened by degrees, like candles dimmed by an unseen hand. He glanced once toward Claire, and in that brief, steady look, something in her shoulders eased. Ethan had no idea who was coming through that door. He only knew the woman he had tried to reduce to a footnote was standing straighter than he had ever seen her. And for the first time all evening, Claire let herself breathe. Claire did not look away from the door, even as the first wave of whispers rose and fell behind her like a tide testing the shore. The man in the charcoal suit crossed the ballroom with the calm of someone who never needed to announce himself. No entourage, no display, just measured steps across a floor that seemed to notice him before the guests did. At the edge of the room, Ethan had turned slightly, his smile still fixed in place, his glass lowered halfway from his mouth. He had seen the man at a distance and assumed what people like Ethan always assumed. Another guest, another face, another name to forget by morning. But names had a way of changing their weight when the room fell quiet. Claire felt it before she heard it, the subtle shift in the air, the way conversations thinned as if someone had opened a window to winter. The man stopped beside her, close enough that she caught the faint scent of cedar and clean linen, clean and restrained, nothing like the loud colognes Ethan preferred. His gaze found hers first, not the crowd, not the groom, not the half-smile of curiosity passing over the tables. Only her. That simple choice seemed to steady something in her chest that had been trembling all evening. For months, maybe longer, she had practiced being invisible in rooms like this. It had become a habit, then a shield, then a wound she learned to wear without flinching. But now, standing beneath all that glittering glass and light, she felt the strange, quiet force of being seen without being judged. Ethan finally noticed the silence spreading outward from where she stood. His eyes narrowed just a fraction, the way they did when something did not fit the story he had prepared. He had expected embarrassment, maybe tears, perhaps the familiar softness of a woman who would lower her eyes and make herself smaller for the comfort of others. Instead, Claire lifted her chin, and the smallest curve touched her mouth. It was not a smile meant to charm. It was something harder to read. Beside her, the man in the charcoal suit extended his hand, not in performance, but in effortless certainty. Claire placed her fingers in his, and in that brief contact, something invisible locked into place. Around them, the ballroom seemed to inhale. A woman near the center table stopped mid-sentence. A server paused with a tray of champagne flutes balanced at chest height. Ethan took one step forward before stopping himself. As though the room had drawn a line he could not cross without losing something he had already begun to fear he never truly possessed. Claire did not rush to explain. She did not rescue him from the silence. She simply stood there, calm and composed, letting the moment stretch until every guest felt its weight. Then the man beside her turned slightly, enough for the light to catch the sharp line of his jaw and the expensive precision of his suit, and he said her name with quiet respect, as if it had always belonged in a room like this. Ethan stiffened, because he knew that voice, or at least he knew enough to recognize what it meant. Men like that did not come to weddings by accident, and women like Claire did not arrive beside them unless something had already changed behind the scenes. The room held its breath, and Claire, for the first time in years, did not need anyone to make room for her. She had already taken it. Before anyone in the ballroom could find their voice again, Claire felt the familiar weight of every eye settle on her shoulders, not with pity now, but with curiosity sharpened into something far more dangerous. Ethan still stood near the center of the room, his expression locked somewhere between confusion and disbelief, while the man beside her remained perfectly still, one hand resting lightly at his side, his presence controlled enough to make the chandeliers above seem restless by comparison. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. When he turned to Claire, there was nothing performative in the way he looked at her, only the steady recognition of someone who understood exactly how much it cost a woman to walk into a room like this and refuse to shrink. "Are you ready?" he asked, the words soft enough to feel private, yet clear enough for the nearest guests to hear. Claire gave a single nod, not because she needed permission, but because the answer had already been written in the way she stood. Her spine was straight. Her hands were calm. The hurt that had once lived so visibly in her face was still there, but it had gone quiet, tucked beneath something stronger. Ethan finally found his voice, though it came out thinner than he intended. "Claire, what is this?" The question hovered in the air, and for one brief second, she saw the old version of herself reflected in it. The woman who used to explain too much, apologize too quickly, and make herself smaller to keep the peace. But that woman was gone now. Claire did not rush to fill the silence. She let it breathe. She let him sit inside it. Then she looked at him with a calm so complete it felt almost merciful and said, "This is my life now." The room seemed to still around those 4 words. A few guests lowered their glasses. Someone near the back made a soft sound of realization. Ethan blinked, as if the sentence had landed harder than any accusation could have. The man beside Claire did not move closer, did not interrupt, did not claim the moment. He simply stood as if he had every right to be there, which somehow made it more unsettling for everyone else. Claire turned her gaze briefly across the room, past the polished tables, past the floral arrangements, past the faces that had once watched her be dismissed, and decided she did not matter. Tonight, they were watching something else entirely. They were watching a woman who had returned without begging, without pleading, without needing to explain the years they had never bothered to understand. Ethan's hand tightened around his glass. His fiancée looked away first. The guests who had whispered earlier now seemed suddenly aware of their own silence. And Claire, standing beneath the soft gold light of the ballroom, realized that this was the part she had never been able to imagine when her life first fell apart. Not revenge, not outrage, just this still, exact moment where no one could deny the shape of her return. She did not look triumphant. She looked settled, as if peace, not permission, had brought her here. And when the man beside her finally said, with quiet certainty, "Claire is here as my guest, and I expect her to be treated accordingly," the room understood at last that the night had already changed hands. Ethan stared at them both, his face draining of color, while Claire kept her expression level, almost unreadable, because she no longer needed to force anyone to see her. They were seeing her now, every single one of them. For the first time in years, Claire woke to a quiet that did not feel empty. It was not the silence of being left behind, but the calm of a life she had finally chosen for herself. Morning light slipped through the curtains of the small apartment she had rented above a flower shop on Mercer Street, turning the pale walls gold and catching on the glass vase of white lilies by the window. The space was modest, but everything in it had been placed with care. A wool throw folded neatly over the sofa. Fresh coffee cooling beside a stack of design sketches. A record player humming low enough to feel like a heartbeat. Years ago, she had mistaken luxury for safety because Ethan had wrapped both in the same polished lie. Now she understood that peace had its own texture. It smelled like clean linen, roasted coffee, and the faint sweetness of lilies opening in the sun. She moved through the kitchen in soft socks, sleeves pushed to her elbows, hair loosely tied back, and for a moment there was no ballroom, no glare of chandeliers, no thin smile from a man who had once treated her kindness like an inconvenience. Only the steady rhythm of her own hands as she poured hot water over grounds and watched the dark color bloom. Her phone rested face up on the table. 3 missed calls from an unknown number. 1 text from Rowan, "I will send the car at 6. Wear the navy dress." Claire stared at the screen for a long second, the corners of her mouth almost, but not quite, lifting. Rowan never wasted words. He never dressed a request like a command. He simply made room for her life and trusted her to step into it when she was ready. That was what had startled her most about him from the beginning. Not his money, though people noticed that first. Not his name, though it opened doors without sound. It was the absence of pressure. He did not rush her. He did not ask her to perform gratitude. He only watched her with that steady, measured attention, as if he understood that healing could not be hurried without breaking something delicate. She set the phone down and crossed to the window. Below, Mercer Street was already awake, delivery bikes sliding past iron railings, a man walking a terrier past the corner cafe, the city moving with its usual confident noise. Claire rested her fingertips against the glass and felt, beneath the skin of the morning, a strange and almost dangerous thing. Anticipation. Not fear. Not exactly. Something cleaner. The invitation from the Langford Foundation had arrived 2 days earlier in a cream envelope with embossed silver lettering, and she had known, even before Rowan spoke, that Ethan would be there. He had become the sort of man who appeared wherever an audience could be found. Charity events, industry galas, anything with a camera flash and an open bar. He would arrive polished and certain, wearing the kind of confidence that only survived because too many people mistook volume for authority. Claire had once mistaken that, too. She had once believed that being chosen by him made her visible. Now she knew better. Being diminished by someone was not the same thing as being loved. She went back to the table and picked up the navy dress from the garment bag Rowan had sent over the night before. Simple, elegant. The fabric was smooth beneath her fingers, the color deep enough to catch the light without begging for it. She laid it across the bed and stood there for a moment, studying it the way a woman studies the shape of her future before she decides to step into it. By afternoon, the apartment had been transformed by small, deliberate motions. Steam curled from the bathroom as she pinned her hair into a low twist. She applied her makeup with a hand that did not tremble. A quiet line of eyeliner. A touch of color on her lips. Nothing excessive. Nothing that asked for permission. When she slipped into the dress, it fit as if it had been waiting for the version of her that no longer apologized for existing. She fastened the delicate clasp at her throat, then looked at herself in the mirror and did not flinch. The woman staring back was not louder than the one Ethan had abandoned. She was simply harder to overlook. At 5:45, the black car Rowan had promised pulled up outside the building with a smooth, almost silent stop. The driver stepped out to open the door, and Claire lifted her coat, then paused long enough to place one hand on the doorframe of her apartment. Just one breath, one heartbeat. Then she left the room she had rebuilt and stepped into the evening, as if crossing a threshold she had earned. The city lights had already begun to glow by the time the car reached the Langford Hotel. Through the tinted glass, she could see the gilded entrance, the waiting press, the slow turn of heads as guests arrived beneath the canopy of warm light. She saw gowns that shimmered like spilled champagne and men in dark tuxedos standing with practiced ease. She also saw the shape of the past waiting somewhere beyond those doors. Ethan would be inside, with his rehearsed charm and his hungry need to be admired. And he would be looking for the version of Claire he thought he had left behind. He would not find her. The car door opened. Cool air brushed her skin. Claire drew one quiet breath, lifted her chin, and placed her hand in the one waiting to guide her forward. And somewhere inside the ballroom, among the crystal light and the rising murmur of the crowd. Ethan Langford had no idea that the woman he had once tried to reduce to a memory was about to walk back into his world with a kind of grace he would never be able to touch again. Before Claire could answer the last shallow greeting that drifted her way, the atmosphere in the ballroom shifted again, subtle at first, then unmistakable. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was simply the kind of change that made polished people turn their heads without meaning to, as if some invisible current had passed through the room and reminded everyone to stand straighter. Claire felt it before she saw it. The pause in the nearby conversation, the slight tilt of a champagne glass, the way one of the older women near the floral arch suddenly stopped smiling. Then she saw him, Daniel Mercer. He moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who never needed to announce himself. In a dark tailored suit that fit cleanly across his broad shoulders, his expression calm, almost unreadable, as he crossed the ballroom with the ease of someone who belonged to every room he entered. The guests around him seemed to part without being asked. Some recognized him immediately and lowered their voices. Others only knew enough to react to the quiet gravity that followed in his wake. Ethan, standing near the center table with two friends and a practiced look of importance, noticed the movement too late. He straightened, smoothed a hand over his jacket, and forced a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. Claire did not move. She only watched as Daniel approached, his attention fixed on her in a way that made the rest of the room blur around the edges. There was no performance in it, no need for one. Just recognition. Just certainty. When he reached her side, he paused long enough for the silence around them to deepen, and then he offered his hand with the kind of simple courtesy that carried more weight than any speech. Claire placed her fingers in his, and the contact was steady, warm, unmistakably real. A few inches away, Ethan had gone still. His smile had thinned to a tight line, his posture locked in place as if the floor beneath him had changed without warning. The friends beside him exchanged glances. One of them looked at Daniel, then at Claire, then back again, as if waiting for someone to explain a mistake that clearly was not one. Daniel turned slightly, still holding Claire's hand, and said her name with quiet respect, as though it belonged in the center of the room. Then he greeted the nearest guests with the same composed ease, but Claire could feel the weight of what remained unsaid. The man beside her did not need to raise his voice. He did not need to claim the room. The room had already begun to understand him. Across the ballroom, Ethan's face had lost its color. He stared at Claire as if he were seeing her for the first time, and perhaps he was. The woman he had dismissed, the woman he had expected to arrive alone and small and easy to overlook, now stood beside a man whose presence made every polished assumption in the room feel fragile. Claire kept her chin level. Her breathing remained even. She did not glance at Ethan, not once. There was no need. The truth was already moving through the crowd in low, careful whispers. And somewhere beneath the crystal lights, among the soft clink of glass and the murmured astonishment, Claire understood something with perfect clarity. She had not come here to be chosen. She had come here already whole. And that was the one thing Ethan could never undo. By the time the ballroom settled back into its expensive, careful rhythm, Claire had already learned the shape of the silence again. It was different now. Not the silence of a woman waiting to be spoken over, but the quiet of someone who had already made her decision and no longer needed the room to approve it. Near the tall windows, where the city lights shimmered beyond the glass, Daniel remained beside her with the same measured calm he had carried through every glance and every pause. He did not crowd her. He did not rescue her. He simply stood there as if his presence were the most natural thing in the world, and somehow that made the space around her feel larger. Across the room, Ethan had started to recover his voice, though it came back thin and strained, the kind of confidence that sounded believable only to someone desperate to hear it. He was smiling again, but it had the brittle edge of a man trying to hold a cracked mirror together with bare hands. Claire could see it in the way his eyes kept drifting toward Daniel, then away, then back again, as if his mind refused to accept what his pride already understood. He had expected an echo of the woman he once knew. He had expected hesitation, discomfort, perhaps even gratitude for being invited at all. Instead, he had found composure. He had found a woman who no longer looked to him for permission to exist in the same room. The more he tried to regain control of the atmosphere, the more fragile he seemed. A laugh from one of the guests sounded forced. A glass touched down too softly on a linen-covered table. Even the music, elegant and restrained, seemed to pull farther into the background, making room for the tension no one wanted to name. Claire let her gaze drift over the polished faces, the crystal chandeliers, the careful arrangements of white flowers that looked too perfect to be real. She remembered another life in another house, one where she had learned to lower her voice, soften her opinions, and step aside so that someone else could shine. That woman had once believed endurance was the same as love. She had mistaken shrinking for peace. Now, standing beneath the light in a dress that fit her like certainty, she understood how much of her life had been spent apologizing for taking up air. Daniel turned slightly, his hand resting near the small of her back, not claiming, only steadying. It was a subtle gesture, yet it changed everything. People noticed the smallest things when they were already looking for a reason to believe a story. And the story beginning to form in that ballroom was no longer the one Ethan had planned. It was quieter than scandal, stronger than gossip. It was the story of a woman who had walked back into a place that once diminished her and discovered it no longer had that power. Ethan finally stepped forward, his expression tightening into something meant to pass as charm. "Claire," he said, drawing her name out with the kind of familiarity that once would have made her flinch. "I was not expecting to see you here like this." Daniel did not react. Claire did not hurry to answer. She only looked at him, not with anger, not even with satisfaction, but with the calm distance of someone observing a faded photograph. "That makes two of us," she said at last, her voice low and even, carrying farther than she intended because the room had grown so attentive. The words landed gently. That was what made them devastating. Ethan's mouth tightened. Around them, heads turned a fraction closer. No one spoke, but the air changed again, heavy now with the sense that something important had just been said without ever needing to be explained. Claire felt the strange and steady pulse of her own breathing, the soft brush of silk against her skin, the cool ring of Daniel's quiet support at her side. For the first time, she was not bracing for impact. She was already on the other side of it. The ballroom had settled into a dangerous kind of calm, the sort that came only after a room realized it had just witnessed something it could not take back. Crystal light shimmered over polished glass and dark suits, and the music that had once filled the air now seemed distant, almost embarrassed to keep playing. Claire stood near the tall windows with Daniel at her side, her hands relaxed, her posture steady, as if she had been built for moments like this and no longer needed permission to survive them. Across the room, Ethan had not moved much, but his attention had narrowed until it felt almost physical. He had spent too many years believing that he understood what Claire would do, how she would speak, when she would bend. Tonight had made a fool of that certainty. He watched her the way people watched a door they had already slammed, unable to decide whether they wanted it open again. A server passed with a tray of champagne, the soft clink of crystal sounding far too loud in the uneasy quiet. Then Ethan tried to recover the room with a smile that looked strained even from a distance. He stepped forward, lifting his glass as though he were still in command of the night. "Claire," he said, and there was a faint edge of performative warmth in the way he drew her name out. "I suppose congratulations are in order. It seems you have made quite an impression." The words were polished, almost generous, but the room could hear the effort underneath them. Claire looked at him for a long moment without speaking, and that silence did more work than any sharp reply could have done. It left him standing there with his own self-importance exposed, his smile thinning at the edges. Beside him, one of the women from his circle gave a small, uncertain laugh, as if searching for the correct reaction and finding none. Daniel did not speak either. He simply remained beside Claire with that same composed stillness, one hand resting lightly at his side, his presence quiet but unmistakable. Ethan glanced toward him, then back at Claire, as if trying to locate the old version of her in the space between them. He could not find it. The realization seemed to irritate him more than the silence itself. "I did not expect this," he added, his tone tightening. "You have changed." Claire's expression did not shift. She let the words hang between them, then answered with a voice so calm it almost sounded kind. "People do," she said. There was no triumph in it, no need to sharpen the moment into a spectacle. That was what unsettled him most. He had come looking for a reaction he could control, a flash of hurt, a sign that he still mattered enough to wound. Instead, he found a woman who stood beyond the reach of his old script. Around them, the room listened in fragments. A whisper moved from table to table. Someone lowered a phone. Another guest turned fully toward the exchange, pretending not to stare while doing exactly that. Claire felt none of the old panic rise in her chest. She only felt the steady rise and fall of her breathing, the smooth fabric of her dress against her skin, and the quiet certainty that she was no longer waiting for anyone to define her in public. Ethan tried one last time to reclaim the power of the moment with a faint smile and a careful tilt of his head. "You are not here alone, then." The question was casual on the surface, but it carried too much curiosity to be innocent. Claire turned slightly toward Daniel, and in that small movement there was more confidence than Ethan had ever seen in her during their marriage. Daniel met her glance, then looked at Ethan with measured calm. "No," Claire said simply. One word, nothing more. Yet it landed with the weight of a door closing softly but completely. Ethan's face changed first, then his posture, as if he had felt the floor shift beneath him before anyone else did. Claire did not look away. She did not explain, and she did not need to. The room had already begun to understand that whatever had brought her here was no accident, and whatever he had imagined about her future had already been left behind in a different life. Daniel did not move first. He never did. He simply stood beside Claire with the kind of stillness that made the room feel louder by comparison, his hand resting lightly at the small of her back, not claiming her, only anchoring her. Ethan noticed that detail too late, as he noticed most things about men like Daniel too late. The ballroom lights caught on the clean line of Daniel's suit, the quiet precision of his watch, the calm that seemed to follow him like it belonged there. Nothing about him was theatrical. Nothing about him needed to be. Ethan, still trying to recover the last thread of control, let out a short, uneasy laugh and glanced toward the crowd as if the room itself might rescue him. "I suppose congratulations are in order," he said, the words polished enough to pass for grace, though his eyes kept flicking back to Daniel. "I did not realize you had moved on so quickly, Claire." There it was. The old habit. The careful little insult dressed as surprise. Claire felt it, but did not flinch. She looked at him the way a person might look at a familiar door after years of walking through a different house. Not with longing, not with anger, just with the quiet understanding that it no longer led anywhere she needed to go. "You realize," Daniel said gently, before Claire needed to answer, "that moving on and rebuilding are not the same thing." His voice was low, even, and in the polished hush that followed, it carried farther than Ethan would have liked. A few heads turned. A few glass rims paused halfway to mouths. Ethan's smile tightened by a fraction. He had expected a performance, a tremor, perhaps even a defense. What he was getting instead was a conversation he could not dominate. Claire's fingers settled once against the side of her glass, and she felt the cool weight of it, the smooth edge of the stem, the steady beat of her own pulse beneath her skin. Years ago, that same silence would have been a surrender. Tonight it was something else entirely. Ethan tried to step back into the center of the exchange, but the room had begun to tilt away from him, subtly, irrevocably. He looked at Daniel with the guarded curiosity of a man trying to place a face he should have recognized sooner. "And you are?" he asked, though the question already sounded weaker than he intended. Daniel met his gaze without hurry. "Daniel Hart," he said. "I handle a few things for Langford Holdings." The name landed softly, almost politely. But Claire felt the shift in Ethan before the room did. Not a dramatic reaction, not at first. Just the faint tightening around his mouth, the slight stillness in his shoulders, the way his attention sharpened in an instant. Langford Holdings was not a casual detail. It was the place Ethan lived his professional life, the empire he spoke about as if it were self-made and untouchable. And now the man standing beside Claire had just placed himself somewhere inside that world with the kind of ease that could not be faked. Daniel's expression did not change. He did not smile, and he did not need to. He simply lifted his glass toward Claire in a small, private gesture, one that seemed to say she did not need anyone to speak for her anymore. Ethan saw it. Claire saw him see it. That was enough. The music continued, soft and expensive, but the room had lost its certainty. Somewhere near the center of the ballroom, a woman lowered her phone. At the edge of the crowd, a man whispered into his drink. Daniel turned his head slightly toward Claire, his voice meant only for her now. "Are you ready?" he asked. And Claire, who had once measured her life in what other people allowed her to have, felt something far steadier settle inside her chest. She was not waiting to be rescued. She was not waiting to be approved. She had already arrived. The room remained suspended in that delicate silence only the wealthy can afford, where every smile is polished, every breath measured, and every truth arrives late. Claire stood at the center of it all with her chin lifted, her hands still, her expression unreadable except for the quiet certainty that had settled there like a sealed vow. Ethan watched her as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he had already failed to understand years ago. He had expected embarrassment. He had expected hesitation. He had expected the old Claire, the one who lowered her eyes and apologized for taking up space. But that version of her had not stepped into the ballroom tonight. That woman had been left behind in a life that no longer belonged to her. Daniel gave a small nod to the man waiting near the edge of the room, and within a moment, the shift began. Not loud, not theatrical, just enough for the closest people to lean in, then the next row, then the whole room to follow. A representative from the company overseeing the renovation project stepped forward with a leather portfolio in hand, and suddenly the purpose of the evening changed shape. The applause from earlier faded into a murmur as papers were opened, signatures were confirmed, and the language of money, property, and authority quietly took over the air. Ethan frowned, then straightened, then frowned again when he realized his own name was no longer being spoken with admiration, but with caution. Claire did not look at him when the final confirmation was read aloud. She did not need to. What mattered was not his reaction, but the way the room reoriented itself around her presence. Daniel remained beside her, calm and composed, one hand resting at his side, the other accepting the portfolio with easy confidence. He had no need to announce himself. The people who mattered already knew, and the ones who did not were about to learn. Claire felt the old fear rise for half a second, like a familiar shadow testing the edge of the light. Then it dissolved. In its place came something quieter and far stronger. She understood that closure was not always a speech, and justice was not always a spectacle. Sometimes it was a signed document. Sometimes it was a room full of people forced to witness the truth they had helped ignore. Sometimes it was simply this, standing in the light, untouched by the hands that once tried to dim it. Ethan finally spoke, but his voice had lost the sharpness it had worn all night. It was smaller now, thinner around the edges. Claire turned to him at last, not with anger, not with triumph, but with the calm of someone who had already left. She did not explain her choices. She did not defend her life. She only let him see what he had never been able to keep. Daniel reached for her hand then, not possessive, not performative, just certain. Claire accepted it with a quiet inhale, the kind that comes when a person stops bracing and starts belonging to herself again. The ballroom lights glowed above them, crystal and distant, as the music returned in a softer register. Around them, the whispers changed shape. Not gossip now. Recognition. By the time Ethan understood what he had lost, Claire was already looking ahead, her reflection steady in the polished glass, her future no longer a question anyone else could answer.